Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Can you hear me all the way in the back there? Okay. I thought I'd share some thoughts with you, but the greatest value, quite frankly, is in our interaction. So I encourage you to ask any question on any topic. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Thanks very much for the introduction. What you should take away all of that was I was blessed to do something that I wanted to do since I was a little boy, be a naval officer. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do in my life. And I got to do it for 37 years. And as I tell my children, I would wish for you what your father had. A dream as a little boy, he got to live the dream, and the reality was even better than the dream I had when I was this tall. As you heard, my focus started a very traditional career, but my focus really became intelligence and cyber. So intelligence, national security agency, one of 17 elements within the US intelligence structure, the largest of the 17. In fact, it is double the size of the next largest element in the US structure. And if we're honest, it is the largest intelligence organization in the free world. So I found myself working every problem of interest to the United States, as well as our friends and allies. So I spent a lot of time with our nation's leadership. I worked for two different presidents, President Obama and President Trump. Boy, different is night and day. So those are some interesting challenges dealing with each of them. But I was very lucky. And then as Cyber Command, this warfighting construct that the department created we believed in the department that cyber was going to become a battlefield, both offensively and defensively. And the department felt strongly that we need a very traditional warfighting structure that can operate in this environment. And so we created Cyber Command. So, and I'm very unusual. I'm running the largest intelligence organization in the US structure, and at the same time, I'm one of the 10 senior most operational commanders in the DoD. So a very different construct. I'm spending my days dealing with the Secretary of Defense, my fellow commanders like Central Command running the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Pacific Commander, and at the same time, I find myself spending a lot of time in the White House dealing with broad national security issues and cybersecurity. And lastly, particularly with President Obama, he asked me multiple times, hey, Mike, you're a bit of a tech guy. Would you go out and interact with the private sector? So I found myself being sent out to Silicon Valley, Austin, Seattle, to try to interact with CEOs and executive leadership for the largest IT and technology companies in the US about, hey, how could we create a stronger partnership between the private sector and government? So I tell you all that because that experiences frame the comments that I'm gonna share with you. So I would argue that we find ourselves as a nation in a period of transition. We spent the last 30 years as the uncontested most powerful nation in the world, based on almost any dimension you want to use: economic, political, military, technology, the information dynamic. And for the last 30 years, it's not been other nation states that have tended to shape our biggest national security challenges. It's been non-state actors. Predominantly terrorism really has gotten the focus in the post 9/11 environment. You started to see a change about 5 years ago, where suddenly the problem sets become much more focused on the nation state again. And for the first time in literally the history of any living American, and I would argue in our history as a nation, we face what I call a competitor, some call an adversary. I like competitor because my concern is when you view someone as an adversary, you really start to narrow the choices that you're willing to make. When you view someone as a competitor, you're willing to consider a broader range of options. And I'm talking about China. For the first time, we face a competitor, my phrase, that offers military strength, political strength, and what makes them different, a level of economic strength we've never had to deal with. Go back the last time we were really in a large nation-state competition, Soviet Union, strong military capability, strong political capability, never contested us economically. And in the end, remember, we broke them economically, they then fractured politically, and they dissolved as a nation. So with the Soviet Union era, we never worried about the economic aspect. We knew that was an area of strong advantage for us, and quite frankly, we used that advantage to create a better position for our nation and our friends and allies. But now with respect to China, we face a totally different dimension. And quite frankly, we're not used to this. We are not used to this idea that we are not the strongest in almost every dimension. That's an interesting challenge for us in the policy choices that we have to make. The second thing I think that's really interesting is, and this really comes out, I would argue, COVID in some ways, not so much because it was a major disease, but COVID has highlighted that the world is a lot more fragile than we thought it was. That the ability to disrupt supply chains, the ability to stop the flow of people, the ability to stop the flow of money is a lot potentially easier than we thought it was. Think about the economic models we built in the last 20 years. This idea that we could distribute supply chains all over the world with a high level of assured access that would enable us to produce, move, integrate, and build capabilities and push it to the end user because we knew exactly how long it took, we knew exactly what was required, and there would be no disruption en route. So we created this set of hyper-connected, very dependent world. That's the model we created. It created amazing economic growth. If you look at our economic journey broadly over the course of the last 20 years, it has really been underpinned by this model that we created, we, the broader world, not just us. And yet, now the model is under threat. Now we're asking ourselves, should I be comfortable pushing my supply chain and core components to other places around the globe? Should I be comfortable with an assumption that I'm going to be able to look at the, for example, if you're into ports, I'm a naval officer, so I always love ports. You look at what is happening with container shipments in the last 2 years. At one point, we were up to a 5-month backlog in West Coast ports to unload container ships coming from Asia. 5 months where you are literally anchored out waiting for pierside space so you can come in and unload. So think about what that has done to our economy, to the supply chain disruptions that we're all experiencing. I give you a personal example with my wife. We literally, because I try to help, I travel a lot, but when I'm home, I try to help by doing things like, hey, honey, I'll go grocery shopping. It's no big deal. We would literally keep a list of things that we were trying to look for months. And my greatest day as a husband, I would come home and say, I found Cantonese noodles in the size we like. You wouldn't believe it. There were 3 of them on the shelves. I got all of them. This is great. I don't ever remember that. You got to go back to the 70s when I was a little boy to remember, disruption with fuel and things like that. At the same time, we're a nation that is internally divided. Whatever your politics are, I think you got to acknowledge, look, we're a divided society right now. That makes it hard to come together to address the toughest problems. And the Russians in particular have been pouring fire on these divisions. Their view is that a divided America that is inwardly focused, that is spending their time fighting and screaming at each other, is less inclined to resist Russian activities elsewhere in the world, and will not have the focus, the attention, the priority, or the will to stand up to Russia. That was his bet on Ukraine. The West talks a great game, but when push comes to shove, they lack the will, they lack the resolve, and they'll be unwilling to take the economic pain to enact these sanctions to try to isolate me. Now we're almost 9 months, February 24th. So later in the month, we'll be at the 9-month mark, and we'll see how this plays out. There's a little bit of a dissonance in timeframes. In the West, we tend to fixate on how much territory the Russians are holding in Ukraine as the measure of success. And so we say to ourselves, well, they're holding less territory than they did. They're steadily being pushed back. Everything's going the right direction. I would argue Putin doesn't look at it that way. Putin does not obsess about how many kilometers of territory he holds in Ukraine. He needs to hold enough, but what his focus is, his argument is time is on my side because we're going to get into the winter. And I want to see, Russia, will see how strong the West is. When their fuel prices quadruple, we'll see what happens, how strong the West is when supply chain disruptions and economic on the downside starts to impact them. And they're already starting to see some potential indicators. In the United States, we have right now, so far, provided almost $100 billion to Ukraine. Humanitarian aid, military aid, financial assistance, 3 major categories. And yet, you have at least one political party in the United States who has said, hey, we're getting concerned about blank checks. And if we gain control, we are going to reassess. And I'm not trying to criticize, I'm just saying, look, this is what you're hearing from the Republican Party. And don't take this as, oh, he's anti-Republican. I'm not into politics. But you got one party that may be coming into control in the House, and if not the Senate. We'll see how this plays out in the coming days. But you got one party that's already talking about, we're not so keen on $100 billion in continued spending like this. We got to get spending under control. So it'll be interesting. I think Putin still thinks time is on his side. So we got a winner we got to get through. And we got to see how this political cohesion stands up. The last point I want to highlight is China, and then I'd like to open it up to questions, because generally China is the area I get the most questions about. We're also at an interesting inflection point with China, because our own nation's attitudes towards China are hardening, and China's attitudes towards us are hardening at the same time. So you got this with a lot of friction. In the case of China, Xi Jinping just confirmed for his 3rd term in the 3 primary roles: head of the state, head of the party, head of the military. Remember, in their structure, 3 different jobs. Those are the centers of gravity, if you will. He controls all 3. He enters a 3rd term, so he's completed 10. Each term in their system is 5 years. He's done 10, he moves into 15. No leader since Mao has done 3 terms. Xi is a really different guy in Chinese history. He is very Mao-like. It also reflects his history. He is what they call a princeling. His father was a member of the party, and for example, was with Mao on the Long March, you know, when the Chinese Communist Party was pushed from the coastal areas and moved inland in the fight against Japan. His father was part of that. His father knew Mao. His father, in fact, for example, his father was head of propaganda for the party in the 1960s. So Xi grew up as the son of a Communist Party leader. He's a guy who truly believes in the power and the centrality of the party. His predecessors, following Mao, Deng Xiaoping, up until Hu Jintao, who was the leader before Xi, generally believed that liberalization and economic openness and less direct party involvement in the economic side was in the nation's best interest. That's what would grow China. Xi comes to power with a totally different vision. He believes the party is central to the long-term development of China as it resumes what the Chinese like to call their rightful place in history. Remember, if you're Chinese, you constantly hear this mantra, the century of humiliation. For the last 125 years, the West took advantage of us. They cut deals, they moved in, they physically created cantonments and areas within China that they controlled. They attempted to destroy us economically, they attempted to destroy us culturally. And Xi argues it's time to put that 125 years behind us. It's time for China to resume its historic role. Their historic role, they use the phrase the Middle Kingdom, the idea that China had this tributary relationship with much of the rest of the world, where other nations actually came and paid tribute to them, given the power of China. So they're very much used to this historic, what they believe is the norm, where China is this significantly powerful nation that others kowtow to, if you will. Xi believes strongly that the party is the central driver in the ability to achieve that vision. So he has done things you haven't seen since Mao. 1, the cult of the personality. Xi promotes himself not just as the head of the party, but as the father of society. You got to go back to the last time you saw that in the party was Mao. He also believes that the party needs to be strong and take pain. One of the first things he did in 2012, when he replaced Hu Jintao, he commissioned a study of the fall of the Soviet Union. He did that because he believed that the Chinese Communist Party could draw lessons on what the Russian or Soviet Communist Party did. He then circulated this study to all the leadership of China, and the study concluded the following. The Soviet Union fell apart as a nation because the Soviet Communist Party gave too many concessions, was too soft, and tried to compromise too much. So she has told the leadership, that is not going to happen to us. The party will not fracture, we will not compromise, we will not be weak. And in fact, we will increase the role of the party in our society, in our economic planning. He reverses a trend that they had been going on for almost 40 years. He's significantly different in that regard. He also believes at a personal level that he is uniquely positioned and that there is no other leader in China who can help China really achieve this vision. It's almost a personal thing for him. It's one of the reasons why he personally connects with Putin. This strategic relationship that China talks about with Russia, about how Russia is a strategic partner, so China will not criticize openly the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've not called for a ceasefire publicly. You know, China's view is Russia is a partner. China wants access to Russia's energy, which is in the eastern part. You know, Siberia, most Russian hydrocarbons, petroleum and natural gas, actually in Siberia in the east, closer to the Chinese market. So China's actually heavily investing at the moment to build infrastructure to move that oil. Much of Russia's infrastructure was set up to move energy from the east to their biggest markets, were in the west, in Europe. With the changes of the last few years, China now becoming their biggest energy partner. So you watch how China is spending to put infrastructure in to move that energy directly south into China. But she looks at what is happening with the United States, and my view is he thought Donald Trump was a bit of an aberration. He thought, remember, Trump having worked for both Obama and Trump and been part of discussions with them, you know, in the sitting room and in the Oval at times about what we were going to do with China. Obama did not want us directly confront them. He felt strongly that that wasn't the best option for us, that we needed to hold them accountable, but the best way to do it was not to publicly beat them up. President Trump, on the other hand, very different. He would sit there and say to us on his national security team, we have greater advantage than most people realize. We need to be tough with these guys. We need to stand up with them, and we don't need allies and friends to do it. We're strong enough that we can take the lead. And so President Trump opted to focus on the following tools with respect to China. He said technology is among the most important things we need to ensure that the Chinese don't gain advantage. He selected one technology in particular, 5G, the next generation of the cell phone backbone, but it's much more than cell phones. We will, with 5G technology, we will bring up mobile connectivity to a level of capacity, speed, and we will push latency down. That is what is going to power, for example, the autonomous car networks that we're going to create, this unsurpassed data connectivity that exists all across our society. He believed that 5G was the one to pick. And then he picked two Chinese companies specifically, Huawei and ZTE, as kind of the poster child for how we need to restrict significant Chinese technologies companies' ability to access technology coming from the United States. And then he also put in a series of trade and tariff restrictions. President Biden comes into power. He says, broadly, remember, he, unlike President Trump had no government experience. President Biden comes in, he'd spent his whole life within government as an adult. His view was, and this is reflected in his history as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he believed strongly that we need to build a framework of like-minded nations. We need to confront China, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily drive them out of the global economic structure. So he was not a fan as he came into office about the idea of decoupling, about totally severing economic, technical, economic relationships in some ways with China. But interestingly, he opted when he first came in, now he's been in almost 24 months, he didn't pull down a single trade or tariff policy that President Trump had enacted. What he said initially was, I need to study and assess. So I'm going to keep all the policies of my predecessor in place. I believe Xi's calculation was, he looked at Biden and he said, This guy is always about multilateral. He doesn't like confrontation. He doesn't want us to decouple. And when he was part of the Obama team, he didn't want to confront China. I think she was hoping the US was going to swing some of its policies and that President Trump's approach would be viewed as an aberration. And what they have found in the last 6 months in particular is President Biden has opted to double down. He has continued this idea of we need to confront China. So look at what we have done with semiconductor policy. While President Trump focused on 5G as the key technology, President Biden and his team identified semiconductors. They came to the conclusion that semiconductors are the underpinnings for much of the core technology of today and the future, an area where we historically had uncontested leadership. If you go back 30 years ago, we were manufacturing about 42% of the chips in the world were manufactured in the United States. You look at where we are now, we're down to almost 10% total. The CHIPS Act, for example, is interesting. You have not seen government industrial policy like this. You got to go back to the 70s in the space and the 60s for space, where the government decided we need to inject a lot of money into the private sector as a way to change the fundamental business dynamic. So what we've done with the CHIPS Act is this idea of we're going to provide government funds to the private sector in the chip arena. They'll use this to build infrastructure in the United States. It'll increase our capacity. We will place restrictions on those companies' ability to share their technology with China. And coming up of interest to many in this gathering today probably, you watch, but early in 23, I believe you're going to start to see restrictions on capital flow into China. Because now the government has come to the conclusion we traditionally used a very narrowly defined national security lens. Technology was really viewed through the prism of national security. And now I believe the Biden team has come to the conclusion we need to expand this. We need to think about economic. So the ability to flow money, what really powers the Chinese economy. We got to make this harder because we want to retain our US advantage. So we are headed for a really interesting time. Literally, in the last 2 years, I would argue only 3 issues in our nation have shown broad consensus in terms of the ability to actually generate a political outcome. 1, infrastructure. We actually put a record amount of money into infrastructure in the last 2 years. 2, COVID. We actually managed to reach agreement. You can argue if it was good or bad, but we managed to reach political agreement that we should inject significant money into the economy associated with COVID. And the 3rd issue where there's broad unanimity of opinion right now, China, China, China. There is literally no one in DC pushing back against the idea that the US strategy needs to be, we need to confront these guys, we need to push back. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, it doesn't matter if you're in the White House, it doesn't matter if you're on the Hill. You look at US media coverage of China. Literally, there are no stories in our media about how China is misunderstood. There are no stories about poor China getting beat up. The media drumbeat is China bad intellectual property and economic practices, China discriminatory, China making it hard for US and Western firms. There is this constant mantra in our society at the moment that we need to confront China. The reason I say that is it suggests to me in the US, there's strong political consensus now across both parties. We need to stand up and we need to push back. And at the same time, Xi and our Chinese counterparts are saying the same thing to themselves about us, that now is the time to push back against the Americans, that this is our time, that we are strong. That means the next few years are really going to be dynamic. It'll be business, it'll be economic, it'll be technology, it'll be national security. And the likely, flashpoints are something around Taiwan that happens, at one point in my career, I was the senior intelligence individual out in the Pacific. And the single biggest thing we always worried about was an inadvertent crisis in the waters of the airspace off China, where we either ended up hitting each other, somebody gets killed, we get somebody crashes, somebody sinks, suddenly we're in the middle of a crisis. That was always the thing that worried us the most. And I'm concerned that the probability of that is increasing, not decreasing. So with that, what is on your guys' mind? I don't want to talk too long. The greatest value. Sir?
Okay. Are you saying there's a unified belief in Washington that maybe Russia is a noisy irritant, but the real true competitor is China?
Yes. I would argue that you don't get much pushback to the concept of what's the greatest strategic challenge. Now, there are differences of opinion of how do you address that challenge and what's the right answer with Russia. But there's broad agreement that the greatest challenge, which I agree with, the greatest long-term challenge for us is China. Look, Russia is a short-term problem. I'm not trying to minimize it. Russia is the only industrialized nation in the world declining population. They're currently at 162 million people. Folks, that's less than half our size, and their population is declining. They have the shortest lifespan of any industrialized world, any industrialized nation in the world. A male right now in China, I think average age expectancy is 58.9 years. Polio. Who here has, when was the last time you saw polio in the United States? I mean, it's one of the 2 diseases we managed to eradicate effectively. Polio, alcoholism, AIDS. Russia has some massive internal issues, and they are a single commodity-driven economic model, hydrocarbons, petroleum and natural gas. And the trend globally is to step away from those fuels, to try to get to cleaner energy. So if that's your primary money source and the rest of the world is walking away from that as a primary, I'm not saying that it won't still be used, but it won't have the same share of the global energy dynamic that it used to. And energy is a really, and I apologize, I'm riffing a bit on your question, sir, but energy is another huge area for us. For the first time, literally, since the 1980s, we are now energy independent. We are now an exporter of petroleum and natural gas. Some of you in this room, like myself, are old enough to remember what it was like in the 1970s. Remember the Arab oil? And I can still remember sitting in my car with my parents on odd days and even days to go get gasoline, and how you used to have to wait in lines, I mean, massive car lines to get fuel. For now, you never know what the future holds, but we haven't had energy independence in decades. Think about the flexibility that gives us. Think about the leverage that gives us with respect to the Russians. You see how that is impacting our relationship with Saudi Arabia right now, where we're going, guys, guess what? We don't need your energy. We don't need your oil to the same extent that we did 20 years ago. And so you need to think through what does that mean for your relationship with us. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Sir? Can you say the beginning again, sir?
Do you think we have the might and the power to stop China from invading Taiwan?
Do we have the might and power to stop China from invading Taiwan? Now, China's bet, first I'll give you China's bet. China's bet, I believe, is that if the Chinese make the because it's a political decision, if the Chinese leadership makes the political decision that they want to invade and capture China, which I don't think is his preference, I don't think that's his first choice, but I do believe that if he feels that reunification is in some way being stopped or slowed unacceptably, he'd be prepared to do it. I believe the Chinese calculation is the Americans are weak and they lack the political cohesiveness to do this. Because as a military guy, one of the things, like I said earlier in my career, kind of the lead intel guy for this problem set, and one of the things we always used to try to tell our policy and political leaders in DC was, if we get into a confrontation over Taiwan, you need to be ready to accept casualty levels and loss rates that we haven't seen since 1945. If we really go toe-to-toe, this is going to be like the Western Pacific again. Now, we won in the end, but the cost was not insignificant. And the Chinese bet that if push comes to shove, we wouldn't be doing that. My attitude is right now, the way things are hardening, we would be willing to respond. The question gets to be, for how long and how much pain would we be willing to take? Because it would not be, it's not something, if the Chinese started this, that within 60 days we'd say, okay, this is all taken care of. This would be a scenario that would take depending on exactly what the Chinese opted to do, some number of, I would argue, literally, if we really went head to head and neither one was willing to back off, this could go months to years. I will say the one example that I find potentially relevant, and we don't look at it that way now, we managed to maintain political will in our nation to keep forces in Afghanistan, for example, from November of 2001 to August of 2022 in a conflict scenario. We had never before, historically, if you look at our history, we had never kept forces in contact against an opponent for that long. Now, it got to be much smaller by the end. So I think yes, but my question is, how long could we sustain it? That would be the hard part. Sir, in the yellow.
As the battleship became obsolete, is the aircraft carrier going the same route?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it won't be the only centerpiece as the battleship and the carrier was in the Second World War. We're literally, you built your entire strategy around how you got them in the right place at the right time to apply their offensive capability. Rather, my view is the carrier becomes a component of a much broader strategy that brings together a whole lot of other capabilities, that it's not just centered around the carrier. Because my concern is, boy, and I say this as a naval officer, and I used to say this when I was in the Navy, we love platforms. We are obsessed with how many ships do we have? How many carriers do we have? And my attitude always was, guys, and perhaps maybe it's because my fleet was the digital. I was responsible for space, for the spectrum, for the world of the network. So I ran a warfighting fleet, but it wasn't based on platforms. It was based on a broader set of capabilities that we could apply globally from literally sitting at a desk. And my argument was, guys, this is the future. One doesn't replace the other, but one changes the other, and we need to think our way through that. Sir, behind you.
Can you talk about, the size of the U.S. Navy's been shrinking, China's been building up a lot of ships. I mean, what's the quality versus quantity mix, and how do you see the readiness of the Chinese?
So the question is, can you talk a little bit about the comparisons in navies? Our Navy's been getting smaller, their Navy's been getting larger. What would you say about our warfighting capability? So first, the greatest advantage we have going for us, we are a very tested organization. We got a lot of operational experience deployed at all over the world at long ranges from home. The ability to sustain that year after year after year, that's our greatest strength. Our tradecraft, if you will, our professional ability, our experience level, really high. Remember, China has not had a their last military conflict, 1979, 1980, on the border between Vietnam and China, largely a ground war, and the Chinese get shredded. That's the last military experience they have. Now, there wasn't really any naval component to it. China, on the other hand, has studied us, the United States, as a military potential opponent. They've identified what they think are our significant advantages, and quite frankly, they've spent a lot of money trying to negate those advantages. So they looked at us and they said, you have this amazing ability to use sensors around the world, particularly in space, to gain situational awareness of what's happening. We need to blind you and take that away from you so you don't know exactly what we're doing. You have shown this ability to project and sustain combat power literally halfway around the world and to apply it for year after year after year. We need to break your ability to do that. So you look at how they use cyber and other things to go after our infrastructure so we can't physically move forces, move material, and keep it going. You look at how they have decided that we are fixated, to your question, sir, about aircraft carriers. So they spent a lot of time trying to develop capabilities that they can use at really extended ranges that, quite frankly, put a level of threat on the carrier that may lead us to pull the carrier back because we're going, we can't defend against some of these missiles. If we get too close, that's not good. So they're trying to push us back further and further out beyond the first, out to the second island chain is the phrase we use in the Navy. So I don't want to minimize China's investment. I don't want to minimize the strategy they put behind it. But I do want to say, look, Warfare is about more than just numbers. It's about more than just platforms. And the biggest edge we have right now, to me, is our experience and our capabilities. And I don't want to lose that. So the biggest concern I'll conclude with from the Navy for me is not numbers of ships, even though, don't get me wrong, I'd love to see more. It's how are we maintaining, how are we improving those assets that we have? How are we maximizing their value? That's the most important question to me. Sir.
So the Belt and Road Initiative that China's undertaken is to get influence over these African countries and the rare metals there and stuff. Are we responding to that at all? How do you feel about how that impacts our security issue?
So the Belt and Road Initiative really started on Hu Jintao. Now it's coming up on almost 20 years now, where China came up with this strategy that said, we need to create access to resources like minerals. We need to create access to port facilities. We need to create the ability to get the tools and the supplies we need to generate this level of economic activity. And we need to generate political influence while we're doing it, so that these nations view us in either a favorable way or they owe us something. They're now subservient in some ways. They're now indebted to us. Personally, I would argue I don't think this is going to work out the way China thinks it will, because you're seeing nations start to wake up to what it means. Sri Lanka is a great example. So the Chinese in the Belt and Road Initiative invested in creating port infrastructure for Sri Lanka, which used to be Ceylon, as an island off India in the Indian Ocean. Sri Lanka defaulted on the loans. And what did the Chinese do? They nationalized the ports and moved Chinese companies in to run them. So when I was out in the Pacific, and if I was still in my old job, we used to remind people, so if you want a relationship with the PRC, you need to remember, this is what they're about. They're not interested in a long-term relationship. They're not interested in how do you sustain a relationship that benefits both of us. They're interested in a transaction that gives them temporary advantage. And if you fail to follow through, they will slam the door in your face and they won't think a thing about it. That's just the way they are. So I don't think it's going to work out quite as well as they would like. I also wonder, will China find its ability to access materials on a global basis? Does that become harder? It'll be interesting. Are they going to see the same kind of challenges we're seeing as we try to sustain this global infrastructure to move material goods back to the United States? So my judgment is still out on it so far. Sir?
When I think about Chinese capabilities in the cyberspace, I think about Mandiant's 2014 APT-1 report, and really my question is, in that report, it really said, China typically used commercial and open source tools in order to embed. They had this huge military apparatus. That report's about 8 years old now. How do you see Chinese capabilities in conducting cybersecurity attacks differing from that period in 2014 in terms of capabilities and how they maintain persistence?
So a big focus of my previous life. Spent a lot of time on this, and in fact was the director of NSA in 2014 when this report came out. So first, China views cyber through a couple lenses. Number one, their view is cyber is a tool that they can use as part of their national strategy to achieve advancement in the core technologies that they believe will underpin economic competitiveness in the digital economy of the 21st century. So think about AI, think about quantum, think about 5G. There's a handful of technologies where they have decided it is those technologies that are going to be the difference. They look at the United States and they say, the reason why the Americans were so successful, they created the key technologies of the 20th century. They got the global standard bodies to adopt their standards, not the European standards, not China's standards. They got the global standard bodies to adopt the US standards. And then the Americans created these companies that monetized the technology and created unsurpassed economic growth. So think about the Amazons, the Apples, the Microsofts, et cetera, of the world. China looks at that and says, we need to beat these guys at their own game. We need to do that by ensuring we create the key technologies of the digital economy. We get the global standard bodies to adopt China's standard as the global standard. And we create Chinese global companies. Think about Alibaba, et cetera. The Chinese model is we're going to outcompete the Americans. We're going to create the global companies of the 21st century. They're going to monetize these technologies that we, China, took the lead in, and that we, China, got the global standard bodies to adopt. They literally are going to try to use the same game plan. Now, it wasn't a conscious game plan in some ways for us. For them, it's a very conscious game plan. Cyber fits into that idea. Their view is different from us. Cyber is a tool to go after some of those technologies. So if I can steal that intellectual property, if I can save billions of dollars in R&D money, if I can accelerate the development timeline by stealing it, cyber, more traditional espionage, use of employees, I mean, they literally have this strategy where they are all out trying to steal what they think are the core technologies where the West and the US still has advantage. Initially, they were doing this, as you highlight in the 2014 report, using a lot of commercial off-the-shelf technologies. What you've watched in the last 8 years since then, they have increased the level of their own government capacity. So think about the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the Ministry of State Security, the MSS. Those are the two largest cyber actors in the PRC government. You look at how they have grown. You look at how they have increased their own capabilities. Now they don't just rely on the private sector. So it's a slightly different model than it was. The biggest thing with the Chinese always was, if you go back to 2014, it was a little less about capability and much more about scale. I mean, not surprising in a nation of 1.4 billion people, they just threw a lot of people at the problem set. I mean, the number of people they had doing, because look, the United States acknowledges we use cyber as a tool for espionage. We penetrate foreign systems. And one of the things I did as a director of NSA. And I can remember looking at them going, my God, the amount of people you have on this. Now, I used to think that, hey, our technology was much better. We were better at this, and we didn't get caught what we were doing in most cases. But that's changing for them. And so they're not backing off either. I mean, and I don't see them backing off anytime soon. Any questions over here? Ma'am.
Do you think digital or alternative currencies have any effect on this in the future?
So do I think digital or alternative currencies have any impact in this future? So a lot of economies, look at what China's doing, trying to digitize the yuan. Look at what Europe is trying to do with, can you create digital economies? So far in the US, our attitude broadly has been, we don't like this as an alternative to existing currency. My opinion is we got it wrong a little bit in the United States. My attitude is the digital piece is not going to go away. We ought to be asking ourselves, how can we create advantage here for us? How can we access this as another element in a broader economic plan that keeps us stronger, keeps our economy stronger? I don't think that the digital currencies of the world are a temporary fad where they're going to go away. What's been challenging is right now we're at something like over 400 different cryptocurrencies around the world, zero standardization, high level of risk. So why has there been so much volatility in this market? High levels of risk, constant change lead to this high levels of investment, then it crashes. High level investment, then it crashes. We're almost into the flavor of the month in some ways with cryptocurrency. That scares off a lot of people who go, look, that unpredictability, that volatility, that's a bad thing. We don't like that from a financial perspective. My attitude is, so how can we go from 400 plus to something much smaller? How can we create something that engenders confidence? Remember, the reason that traditional currency works is not because it's printed on some special paper. It's because it implies a level of trust that this note is going to be backed by the power of the largest economy in the world and the US government. That engenders a level of confidence that leads to people saying, you know, I don't care about the politics. Hey, I'm interested in stable economic return. The dollar's a sound investment for me. I'd like to see, can we apply that same rationale to the digital world and ask ourselves, not necessarily does that replace the dollar, at least in conventional currency? That's not what I think the goal should be. But rather, I think we should be saying to ourselves, could we use this to build on that great strength we already enjoy in conventional currency. I also think that keeps us relevant.
What's the next generation of ransomware, and what would you advise a small business or
Jack.
individual?
So what is the next generation of ransomware, and what would you advise a small business? So the biggest, while nation states get all the attention for cybersecurity, the reality is the criminal actor is the single greatest challenge to most of us as individuals and to most of us in our businesses. Ransomware really starts taking off about 5 years ago, and then when we go into COVID, as we proliferate network structures, now we're not all at the office, we're working from home, we're using the same systems to do our gaming, to do our video links, to stay in touch with our families, and we're using the same infrastructure to do business. Suddenly we're proliferating, the perimeter has gotten much bigger. As an attacker and a defender, I defend networks for a living and I attack networks for a living. As an attacker, that made my job a whole lot easier. Gives me a whole lot more doors to potentially get into the network structure. Criminals saw this and took advantage of it, both because they had more opportunity, there were a lot more doors to be able to open, and you look at the sectors that generally grew the most in terms of activity: healthcare, education, finance, because in the middle of the pandemic, they thought those were the businesses that would be most willing to pay. If you're a hospital, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're in the middle of a pandemic, what's your risk tolerance in terms of disruption of your business model? It's, hey, look, we're running a health organization here. People are depending on us. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We got to keep running, pay the ransom. So you saw an increased willingness to pay. You saw the pay levels going way up. The biggest changes, to get to your question in some ways, was if you go back 2 to 5 years, generally the criminal entity would gain access to your network. They were inside the network, depending on how good they were and what their objective was. Broadly, they were inside your network for anywhere from 2 to 6 months before they revealed themselves. And then when they did reveal themselves, they generally said, by now you've seen that you're unable to access some of your data. That's because we've uploaded an encryption program and basically put it in a safe. And if you want the combination to the safe, you're gonna pay us. What's changed in the last couple of years is they're not only doing that, but now you're also seeing them informing you of the penetration by sending you some of your data and saying, here's proof that we're on the inside. And number two, not only do you have to pay us to unlock that safe, but if you don't pay us, we not only won't open the safe, but all this information we extracted, guess what? We're gonna make it publicly available. We're gonna embarrass you with the idea that that will increase the probability that companies will pay. Where I see this going is, first of all, it's not gonna decrease anytime soon. The money is just too big. Depending on what source you wanna use, I think the last thing I saw in 2022 projected we're at about $1.5 trillion globally in ransom. 1.5 trillion, that is bigger than the economies of Italy, as an example. No negatives against my Italian friends. It just gives you a sense for scale. It is a lot of money. I've seen some estimates that say at current trends, by the end of the decade, we'll be at $5 trillion a year in ransom. That gets you to the size of multiple nations' economies. So it's massive. Because of that, the incentives are there to keep this up and to get more aggressive. You've also seen criminals. I never saw until about a year ago a criminal use what we call a supply chain attack. A supply chain attack is when an adversary studies the target and says, what software do you use? If I can go to the maker of that software, if I can penetrate their system, if I can manipulate that software so that they don't recognize it, when you, the user, then take that software and upload it, now you've uploaded a whole set of viruses that give me control. It's riskier, it has a higher probability of detection, but it is a high payoff if you're good at it, if you can make it work. I never thought I would see criminals go down that road because it takes more time. Criminals are all about maximum return on investment. Their thinking is, I want to hit as many targets simultaneously as I can, and then I want to move on. Because the cost of getting caught, if you're a criminal, extradition, jail, imprisonment, as I used to kid our workforce, look, everything we do when we penetrate systems outside the United States is in accordance with law, with international law and well-established norms of behavior. We're not going to get extradited. We're not going to get charged. I don't worry about that. I never did. That's not true for criminals. So I see this accelerating. One of the byproducts of the war with Ukraine could be, you're seeing a proliferation of government tools now with non-state actors. The Russians are starting to share tools a lot more broadly. What if those tools start being used by criminals now to increase their ability to access against more defended systems? That worries me. So bottom line, I just don't see this going anywhere. I think we got time for maybe 2 more. Sir?
Is it an idle threat, or will Putin possibly use nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
So would Putin consider using nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Would he consider it? Yes. Is it likely? No. Is it possible? Yes. What would shape the calculation? I believe Putin would only use nuclear weapons if he felt that he had no other option with respect to his ability to retain some level of control in at least parts of Ukrainian territory. If his back was to the wall, for example, if he thought he was going to lose the Crimea. Now, the US and others have been very direct with him in the last few months, which was why you saw the Russians 2 weeks ago come out and publicly say, oh, we would never use nuclear weapons unless the following specific, very much in line with what we normally say. The US went to Russia privately and said, if you use nuclear weapons, you have now changed the game, and we are going to immediately use conventional weapons against your economy and your infrastructure. And it will cost you billions, if not trillions, to rebuild. Do you really want to go down this route? Because the first time you pop a nuke, we're going after your port facilities, we're going after your harbors, we're going after your rail distribution systems. We are going to slam your infrastructure like there's no tomorrow. It's going to take you years to rebuild and literally hundreds of billions of dollars. Do you really want to go down this road? It'll be a Pyrrhic victory for you if it does work out. So we'll see. And you just had China this week, for example, publicly talk about, hey, the Russians shouldn't use nukes. Only the North Koreans, I think, are the one nation in the world that might consider going down that road. I think time for one last one, because I'm mindful of everybody's time. Sir, you're going to take us home as you started it.
Well, I just want to ask you a little bit more about Belt and Road.
Belt and Road.
The Chinese are very strategic about getting access to global resources. You said that is maybe a less successful strategy
Right.
at the time. My impression is in these underdeveloped countries that have these resources, they bribe the elected officials and all their buddies, and then they get all the resources. Is that still a threat, or is that just
It's still a threat, but you're seeing an interesting U.S. response in the last 6 months. So the U.S. has acknowledged that we need to come up with a strategy designed to counter Chinese influence and Chinese investment. So it's manifested itself first in the South Pacific, where we have opened a series of embassies and consulates, and we have increased our level of economic assistance to try to provide an alternative. Hey, look, you don't have to go to China to get money to build a port, to build a railroad, to physically move, build the infrastructure to move iron ore from 200 miles inland to a port facility so you can ship it. We will help you, and we'll give you low-cost loans, and in some cases, we'll give you grants. The challenge for us is the amount of scale. So we're now late to this. We've kind of picked the South Pacific as the initial case study, so to speak. Now you're going to see, are we going to be willing to extend this to Africa, other elements in Asia, where China has been a little more successful and has been there for a long time? Again, one of the challenges in all of this is to execute this strategy. In some ways, as citizens, we are going to sign up to the idea we're going to be willing to pay more for goods and services, potentially, in some areas. We as a society, if we go down this road, we are signing up to the idea we're going to move some key technology, some key infrastructure back to the United States, and we're going to be willing to spend potentially taxpayer money, or we're going to be willing to give favorable tax and other credits to the private sector to do this. We're signing up to the idea we are going to be willing to spend more money outside the United States to try to overcome some of these Chinese efforts to influence and to gain access. So there shouldn't be any doubt in any citizen's mind that as we go down this road, there are implications for us, our economy, our strategy, our national security. And that in order to make this strategy work, we collectively as a nation have to be willing to endure some level. Pain may be too strong, but it can't be just about everything's got to be the cheapest, everything's got to be the quickest. That's not the strategy that we're articulating right now, that if we're really going to confront these guys, we have to be willing to take some measure of pain. And remember, if you're Putin, if you're Xi, that is one of the things they count on. The US is an affluent society, lazy people. They've lived off their success for decades. They're not hungry, and they're not willing to work hard like we are. Their view is that's their edge. My view is every time we are challenged, we come together. Every time we are challenged, we have shown the ability to be resilient, we have shown the ability to pivot, and we have shown the willingness to take pain and make investment. Where this gets hard is we're trying to do that at a time when arguably we have never been so internally divided. So at a time, based on the dynamics in the world around us, based on the strategies that we are choosing, where we need more cohesion, greater will, greater ability to come together, we find ourselves at a time in our cycle as a nation where that is not the norm of behavior. So there's friction there. And in the coming next few years as a society, regardless of whatever your political viewpoints are, my argument would be if we don't get this, if we don't overcome this ability to work together, they're going to win and we're going to lose. And this is on us, not them, it's on us. To me, we have always shown our best when times are the toughest. My attitude is that's an advantage for us. I want to show those guys we will outwork you, we will out-innovate you, we will out-entrepreneur you, we'll out-invest you. Because we love competition. The one thing that I always try to say to foreigners or non-US people who don't live in the United States, if you want to understand America, you got to understand this idea that we are taught since we are little children, literally, competition is good. Competition brings out the best in you. Challenge makes you stronger. We traditionally have embraced those ideas as a society, not just in our organizations, not just in our structures, but at a personal level as people. You know, we were taught this. Competition is good. My attitude is we keep that up. I feel very confident in our ability. And the last comment I would make is, look, I am not one who believes that if I look at China, the future is a linear extension of the past. I look at them and I go, okay, 1.4 billion people. You are Japan at 5 times the size. Aging society. They're paying the price for the one-child policy that was in place up until a decade ago. Their male-female demographics, totally out of whack. Their age, totally out of whack. They're an old society because they will only allow one child for the longest time. And you look at now the Chinese government is in an active campaign to get Chinese families to grow. And it's interesting, it's like listening to American families. Chinese families are saying to the Chinese government right now, do you know how expensive it is to raise children? Do you know what college costs? Even in China, you know what college costs? You know how hard it is to get children in China into competitive academic programs? We don't want big families. We can't afford big families. We're living in high-rise apartments. The majority of us don't have homes, houses, individual structures. Look, it's too expensive to have your children. So China's running into the same challenges you're finding in our own society, where our family sizes are smaller than they were 30 and 40 years ago. They have used brute force in some ways for economic growth. Coal-fired power plants. They, in some ways, if you look at them environmentally, internally, they remind me, again, I'm old enough, the way America was in the 60s and the 70s. Remember, those of you old enough, we had literally Lake Erie catching fire, the creek in Cleveland, catching fire. We were concerned about our ability to breathe our air. We were concerned about what was happening to our water. We made a conscious choice as a society in the 60s and the 70s that we wanted economic growth, but not at the price of destroying the environment we lived in. China isn't there yet. They have been willing to destroy the environment they live in to generate this economic growth. It's going to come back and bite them in the butt, just like it did with us. And again, it's not that you can't overcome it, but it means you got to change your investment priority. You got to spend money on things that perhaps aren't, quote, your national security priorities. With that, thank you very, very much, because we need to keep you out of here on time. Thanks very much, you guys.